The first thing I felt was an unbearable sting, a searing pain that clawed into my eyes like molten needles. Then came the burning, spreading from my face down my throat, choking the breath from my lungs. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and the world tilted sideways as my service dog, Ranger, let out a distressed bark. A shrill voice pierced the chaos. "That's what you get for trespassing, thief!" Through the haze of agony, I barely made out the silhouette of my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, a woman whose defining features were an overinflated sense of self-importance and a never-ending crusade to enforce imaginary laws. I struggled to respond, but every time I tried to open my mouth, my throat spasmed, my breath wheezing against the fiery chemical assault. Pepper spray. She had actually pepper-sprayed me. My face was on fire, my eyes were watering uncontrollably, and Ranger was pacing in distress, nudging my shoulder with frantic concern. The injustice of it all flared in my chest, cutting through the pain. I wasn't some trespasser lurking in the shadows. I wasn't even standing on her property. I was unlocking my own front door, in broad daylight, after taking Ranger for his afternoon walk. The absurdity of the situation might have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. My neighbor had a long history of nosiness, but this was a new level of unhinged. Her voice rang out again, dripping with misplaced triumph. "You thought you could just sneak around here? Not on my watch." She had that smug, self-righteous tone, the kind that suggested she expected a medal for her bravery. I wiped at my face with my sleeve, a mistake, as it only spread the burning sensation further. The pain was overwhelming, but so was the rising frustration. My only crime was existing in proximity to someone with a persecution complex and a can of pepper spray. A commotion stirred behind me as doors swung open. A couple of neighbors peered out, drawn by my hacking coughs and Ranger's distressed growls. Their eyes flicked between me, on my knees, struggling to breathe, and Mrs. Hargrove, standing there like a self-appointed sheriff who had just bagged the criminal of the century. Someone gasped. A voice muttered, wait, isn't he?" And then a louder voice, laced with disbelief. "That's Sam. He lives here." The realization rippled through the small crowd, expressions shifting from confusion to shock to barely concealed horror. Mrs. Hargrove either didn't notice or didn't care. She was too busy dialing 911, her fingers punching the numbers with the urgency of someone reporting a major felony. "Yes, hello, I just stopped a dangerous man from breaking into my neighbor's house. He has a vicious dog. Send someone immediately." My mouth fell open. The sheer audacity of it all nearly short-circuited my brain. Even through the relentless burn in my eyes, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't just doubling down, she was upping the stakes. She was calling the cops on me for getting attacked in front of my own house. Ranger let out a sharp bark, his body tense, ears pinned back. He wasn't aggressive by nature. He was trained to assist, not attack, but even he seemed to understand that something was wildly wrong. He stood his ground between me and Mrs. Hargrove, his golden fur bristling slightly. The crowd of onlookers had grown, some people whispering among themselves, others openly staring. A few had their phones out, recording. Oh, she had really done it now. I finally found my voice, though it was hoarse and raw. "Mrs. Hargrove, this is my house." The words came out broken, more croak than speech. She scoffed, not even looking at me as she continued rattling off exaggerated details to the dispatcher. "He's trying to claim he lives here. I don't believe him. He's been sneaking around for weeks. I knew something was off about him and that mutt of his." The words cut deeper than the burning in my eyes. Not because they were true, but because they were so blatantly, idiotically false. I had lived in this house for 3 years. Ranger had been by my side for nearly 5. I wasn't some nameless stranger passing through. I was a veteran, an amputee, a damn homeowner. The sheer ridiculousness of it all might have sent me into a fit of laughter if I wasn't still struggling to see straight. A neighbor, an older man named Ted, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than both of us, stepped forward, looking both furious and bewildered. "Hargrove, what the hell are you doing? That's Sam. He's a veteran. That's his damn dog. You just maced him for walking into his own house." Something flickered across her face for the briefest moment. Uncertainty? A hint of doubt? But it was gone as quickly as it came. She squared her shoulders, eyes flashing with defiance. He was acting suspicious. I was protecting the neighborhood. The level of delusion was staggering. I was dressed in jogging clothes, holding a leash, carrying my house keys. What part of that screamed criminal mastermind? The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Oh, she's really done it now." Another neighbor, a woman named Clara, had her phone aimed directly at Mrs. Hargrove, recording every word, every ridiculous gesture. "This is gonna be good," she murmured. I managed to wipe enough of my face to squint up at the scene unfolding around me. A patrol car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. One of them took one look at me, red-faced, swollen-eyed, struggling to breathe, and his expression shifted immediately. Recognition dawned. "Sam?" That was when something even more unbelievable happened. Mrs. Hargrove pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice reaching a fever pitch. "Arrest him. He's trespassing." The second officer blinked, exchanging a glance with his partner. The first cop, Officer Ramirez, someone who had actually spoken to me several times before, let out a long, slow breath. "Mrs. Hargrove, you pepper-sprayed a disabled veteran in front of his own house?" The second officer turned to the gathered crowd. "Did anyone see what happened?" A dozen hands shot into the air. Mrs. Hargrove's expression twisted. "I was only protecting the neighborhood," she repeated, but her voice cracked at the edges. The weight of the situation was finally beginning to settle. I would have found some satisfaction in that, if not for the fact that I was still barely able to see. The only thing I could do was sit there, listen, and wait, because Karma had just arrived, and she was about to get a front-row seat to the consequences of her own stupidity. The silence that followed was thick with tension, punctuated only by the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional murmur from the growing crowd. The officers stood between me and Mrs. Hargrove, their eyes darting between the red swelling on my face and the absurdly composed woman still clutching her phone like a lifeline. My service dog, Ranger, had shifted closer to me, his warm presence grounding me even as my body still trembled from the burning sting of the pepper spray. Every breath I took was labored, my throat raw, my eyes still leaking tears against my will. One of the officers, Ramirez, exhaled slowly and shook his head as he turned toward his partner. "This might be the dumbest call we've had all week," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for me to hear, but Mrs. Hargrove either didn't notice or refused to acknowledge it. She stood her ground, arms crossed, her self-righteous indignation boiling over into outrage. "Why are you just standing there?" she snapped, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "I told you he was trespassing. He's been loitering around here with that dog, and I have every right to defend myself." The second officer, a younger man with a tired expression, scribbled something down in his notepad before glancing toward the onlookers. "Anyone here actually witness what happened?" he asked, barely looking up from his notes. Immediately, a chorus of voices erupted at once, overlapping in a chaotic medley of explanations, disbelief, and outright laughter. Ted, my elderly neighbor, took a step forward, shaking his head in exasperation. "This is his house, officer. I've known Sam for years. He walks that dog every damn day. This woman just attacked him for existing." Another voice chimed in, Clara, the woman who had been recording the entire fiasco. "I got it all on video. She maced him for no reason and then called you guys like she was the victim." She waved her phone for emphasis, and for the first time, Mrs. Hargrove's unwavering confidence wavered. Her expression twisted into something unreadable, her fingers tightening around her phone. "That video is misleading," she announced, her voice cracking slightly. I felt threatened. He was acting suspicious, and I have every right to feel safe in my own neighborhood." The words were weak, hollow, as if she could hear how ridiculous they sounded even as they left her mouth. Officer Ramirez let out a low whistle and turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. "You okay, Sam? Do you need medical attention?" The question was well-intentioned, but the sting in my eyes and the fire in my lungs were still too fresh for me to answer properly. I gave a stiff nod, wiping uselessly at my face with the sleeve of my jacket. "I just need water," I croaked out. Immediately, Clara disappeared into her house and returned within seconds with a bottle of water and a wet towel. I took them gratefully, pressing the damp cloth to my burning skin, but the relief was fleeting. Ranger, still alert and bristling, nudged my arm, his tail flicking anxiously. The dog knew something was still wrong, and he wasn't alone. Mrs. Hargrove had gone strangely silent, her gaze darting between the officers and the phone in her hands. It was clear now that she realized this wasn't going the way she expected, and her mind was scrambling for a way out. "I was just trying to keep the community safe," she tried again, but this time, her voice lacked the previous bravado. "I didn't know who he was. I thought he was dangerous." Ted let out an incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "He's got a prosthetic leg and a service dog, you idiot. What part of that screams dangerous to you?" The crowd muttered in agreement, and the weight of the situation pressed down on Mrs. Hargrove's shoulders like a vice. The officers exchanged another glance, a silent conversation passing between them before Ramirez spoke again. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm going to need you to step away from the victim." The word made her flinch, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Victim? I was defending myself. I have rights," she sputtered, but her voice was losing its edge, the panic creeping into her tone. Ramirez didn't react, simply reaching for his radio as his partner finally looked up from his notepad. "Assault with a prohibited weapon," he muttered, clicking his pen shut. "That's what we're looking at here." Mrs. Hargrove took a step back, her face paling. "Weapon? It was just pepper spray." The younger officer shrugged. "In this state, it's classified as a controlled weapon. And considering you used it without provocation, that's assault." For the first time, true fear flashed across Mrs. Hargrove's face. The confidence, the entitlement, the self-assurance that she was in the right, it all crumbled in real time as she realized the situation was slipping completely out of her control. "Wait," she tried again, her voice frantic. I was scared." He looked like a threat." Ramirez let out a long sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, you pepper-sprayed a man with one leg and a service dog outside of his own home. There is literally no way to justify that." A heavy silence followed, stretching painfully long. Mrs. Hargrove's hands trembled, her eyes darting between the officers, the gathered neighbors, and finally me. For a fleeting moment, I saw something like regret flicker in her expression, but it was gone in an instant, replaced once again by defensive arrogance. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice sharp again, though this time there was a desperate edge to it. "I was just doing what any good citizen would do. This is a misunderstanding." Ramirez turned back toward me, his expression unreadable. "You pressing charges, Sam?" The question felt like a stone dropping into my stomach. My eyes, still watery and raw, locked onto Mrs. Hargrove's. There was no remorse there, not really, just fear of consequences. For a moment I considered the weight of it all, the absurdity of how a normal day had spiraled into this mess. Then I nodded. "Yeah," I said hoarsely. "I'm pressing charges." The moment the words left my mouth, Mrs. Hargrove's expression shifted from indignant disbelief to full-blown panic. Her mouth opened and closed, her mind scrambling for an escape, but there was none. The officers had already made up their minds, and the crowd of neighbors watching her downfall like an unscripted reality show ensured there was no way to twist this in her favor. Ramirez didn't hesitate. He motioned to his partner, who immediately stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Mrs. Hargrove, you're under arrest for assault with a prohibited weapon," he said in a tone so dry it was clear this wasn't the first ridiculous arrest he'd made this month. As soon as the metallic click of the cuffs locked around her wrists, the dam finally broke. Her composure shattered, and the self-righteous warrior act melted away into full-blown hysterics. "You can't do this," she shrieked, twisting in their grasp. "I was protecting the neighborhood. He's dangerous. Look at him." She was practically foaming at the mouth now, eyes darting around the crowd for support, but all she met were expressions ranging from mild amusement to absolute disgust. Ted folded his arms, shaking his head like a disappointed father, while Clara casually turned her phone toward Mrs. Hargrove again, catching every second of her meltdown. I took a slow breath, my throat still burning from the pepper spray, but the satisfaction of watching the woman who had just attacked me lose her mind was enough to push the pain aside for a moment. Ranger sat beside me, his tail flicking, clearly sensing the shift in energy. He let out a low huff, unimpressed by the woman's theatric. The second officer, clearly used to handling unreasonable people, barely flinched as Mrs. Hargrove continued to twist and shriek. "You have the right to remain silent," he continued smoothly, despite the fact that she was doing the exact opposite. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is harassment," she bellowed, thrashing as much as the cuffs would allow. "I demand a lawyer. I demand." She suddenly went rigid, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Then, with all the grace of a soap opera villain, she inhaled sharply and turned to the officers with a new strategy. "This is discrimination. You're only arresting me because I'm a woman. This is sexist. If he had attacked me, you wouldn't be doing anything." The second officer let out a breath, his patience visibly thinning. "Ma'am, we have at least 3 different video recordings showing you attacking him unprovoked. Those are doctored," she snapped. "Fake. AI, or whatever you people use these days." Clara let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head as she flipped her phone's screen toward one of the officers. "I recorded it live, sweetheart. And just so you know, it's already uploaded. Congrats, you're famous? That did it." The moment realization dawned that her tantrum was already on the internet for the world to see, something in Mrs. Hargrove visibly snapped. Her face went ghostly pale, her mouth trembling as she tried to process the reality of what she had done. You can't. This isn't," she stammered, her voice suddenly much smaller than before. "My family, my job, my reputation." For the first time, she actually looked afraid, not of some imaginary criminal lurking in the shadows, but of the consequences she had brought down on herself. Ramirez sighed, running a hand down his face. "Ma'am, at this point, you should probably stop talking." He nodded toward his partner, who gently guided Mrs. Hargrove toward the patrol car, though she still muttered frantic half-sentences under her breath. The reality of her situation was finally settling in, and it was like watching a sandcastle collapse under a rising tide. As she was placed in the back of the car, her gaze locked onto me, and for a brief moment I saw something in her expression, maybe not regret, but a realization that this had spiraled far beyond her control. Then, just as the door was closing, she spat out her final words like a curse. "You'll regret this. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll sue. I'll ruin you. Just wait." I didn't say anything. I just watched as the door slammed shut, muffling whatever else she had to say. Clara let out a low whistle. "Well, that was dramatic." Ted chuckled beside her, shaking his head. "I knew she was nuts, but I didn't think she was full-blown lunatic status." I exhaled slowly, rubbing at my face again, though the burning was beginning to subside. The entire situation still felt surreal, like something out of a bad sitcom. I never expected to come home from a simple walk and end up getting attacked by my own neighbor, let alone watch her get arrested in front of half the neighborhood. But here we were. Ramirez approached me again, his expression shifting into something more sympathetic. "You good, Sam?" he asked again, nodding toward Ranger, who had finally started to relax beside me. "You want us to call for paramedics?" I shook my head, though my voice was still rough when I spoke. "I'll live." Just need to get this stuff out of my system. He nodded in understanding. We'll be filing the report. You can follow up at the station when you're ready to press charges. His tone made it clear that I absolutely should press charges, and I had no plans of letting this slide. I had spent years in the military, trained for combat, faced worse than this, but that didn't mean I had to tolerate being attacked by some delusional suburban warrior with a hero complex. Yeah, I said finally, exhaling. I'll be there. Ramirez gave me a nod, then turned back toward the car as his partner climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and within moments, Mrs. Hargrove was gone, her face still pressed against the glass, burning with humiliation. The neighborhood began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, already anticipating the gossip that would no doubt circulate for weeks. Clara clapped me on the shoulder before heading back inside, and Ted gave me one last knowing look before wandering back toward his porch. I was finally alone again, just me and Ranger, standing in front of my own house. I let out a breath, shaking my head as I glanced down at the dog beside me. Well, I muttered, rubbing the space between his ears, that was a hell of a walk. Ranger just let out a soft huff, and with that, we finally stepped inside, closing the door behind us. The following morning, the entire neighborhood was still buzzing about what had happened. Word spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before the videos started making rounds beyond just the neighbors. Clara had made sure of that, uploading the footage to every social media platform known to man, and by the time I woke up, my phone was flooded with missed calls and messages. Some were from concerned friends, others from curious acquaintances who had caught wind of the insanity and wanted confirmation that yes, my own neighbor had maced me in front of my house, and yes, she had then proceeded to call the cops on me, only to be arrested herself. Ranger lay curled at my feet, snoring softly as I scrolled through my messages, my eyes still puffy from the aftereffects of the pepper spray. I didn't even know where to start. Between the sheer absurdity of the situation and the lingering soreness in my throat, it was hard to process just how quickly everything had escalated. What had started as a simple walk home had turned into something that was now being dissected by thousands of people online, and by the looks of it, Mrs. Hargrove's reputation was taking a nosedive at record speed. By midday, the neighborhood group chat had turned into a full-blown courtroom debate. Some people were still in shock, others were reveling in the drama, and a few were gleefully sharing new developments as they came. Someone had apparently looked into Mrs. Hargrove's past and found out that she had a history of making outrageous complaints to the HOA, trying to get people fined for things as ridiculous as using the wrong shade of white for their fences. Another neighbor had dug up an old dispute where she had attempted to have someone's dog declared dangerous because it had barked once while she was walking by. It was as if the entire neighborhood had finally realized that they had been dealing with a ticking time bomb, and now that she had finally exploded in spectacular fashion, everyone was coming forward with their own grievances. It was a full-blown reckoning, and she wasn't around to defend herself because, as it turned out, she was still sitting in a holding cell. Ramirez had texted me later that afternoon to let me know that she had spent the night in jail after refusing to cooperate with processing, screaming at the officers that she was the real victim and that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. He said she had tried to call a lawyer but was struggling to find one willing to take her case after seeing the footage. Apparently, she had also attempted to call the mayor's office, claiming this was an outrageous miscarriage of justice and demanding immediate intervention. No one was taking her seriously. Later that evening, I finally went down to the station to file my statement, still feeling the sting of residual irritation in my skin. Ramirez met me at the front desk, his expression torn between sympathy and exasperation as he led me through the process. I answered every question, detailing exactly what had happened, and when we were finished, he let out a long sigh, flipping his notepad shut. "You know," he said, rubbing his temple, "I've been a cop for 10 years and I've seen some dumb stuff. But this might be top 5. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. "Glad I could contribute?" He smirked. Oh, you contributed, all right. Half the department is talking about this. And let's just say the judge who's gonna be handling this case already saw the footage and was not impressed with her performance. I didn't ask what that meant, but I had a feeling Mrs. Hargrove was in for a rough time in court. By the time I got home, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter, maybe. There was an undeniable shift in energy, as if everyone had finally been freed from the tyrannical reign of the woman who had spent years making life difficult for anyone who so much as breathed in a way she didn't approve of. People were out and about, more social than usual, exchanging knowing smiles and waving at me as I passed. Clara grinned as she leaned against her porch railing, raising her phone. "You've officially gone viral, by the way," she called. "Some news site picked up the footage. You might be famous." I groaned, rubbing my face. "Great. Just what I needed." "Oh, don't worry," she added with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Mrs. Hargrove is the real star of the show. And let's just say people are not on her side." A week later, the full weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. She was charged with assault, misuse of a prohibited weapon, and filing a false police report. The court date came quicker than expected, and when she finally appeared before a judge, her once proud confidence had been reduced to a bitter, defensive shell. She tried every excuse in the book, blaming me, the police, the neighborhood, and even the media, but nothing worked. The evidence was undeniable. The judge didn't buy a word of her nonsense, and in the end, she was hit with a hefty fine, mandatory anger management classes, and a permanent restraining order that forbade her from coming within 50 feet of me or Ranger. She was humiliated, her reputation in tatters, and to add insult to injury, the HOA promptly voted to have her removed from the neighborhood entirely. Within a month, her house was up for sale, and not a single person was sad to see the moving truck pull up in her driveway. On the day she finally left, I stood on my porch with Ranger at my side, watching as she climbed into her car, her face tight with bitterness. For a brief moment she met my gaze, and I saw it again, that flicker of disbelief, that resentment that things hadn't gone her way. She had built her whole life on the illusion that she was the ultimate authority, that she could dictate how the world should be. But reality had finally caught up with her. She turned away, slammed the door, and drove off without another word. I let out a slow breath, glancing down at Ranger, who wagged his tail as if sensing that balance had finally been restored. "Guess we don't have to worry about getting maced on our own property anymore," I muttered. He gave me an approving huff in response. I gave one last look at the now empty house before turning back inside, shutting the door behind me, and finally, for the first time in weeks, letting out a deep, satisfied laugh.